Okay, welcome everyone to Renée Scott, An Extraordinary Life. I'm Sheila Budoff with the Arlington County 55 Plus program. So the program is being recorded and will be posted on the 55 Plus YouTube channel for people to view at a later time. Today's program is in commemoration of Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, which began last night at sundown. I'm delighted to welcome all of the participants from Arlington County's 55 Plus program, and also those who are in person at Run 55 Plus Community Center, and those who are viewing this Zoom from home. Many thanks to Brittany Miller for making it possible for those of you who are able to view the program from Run. We appreciate your help, Brittany. Thank you so much. Also, welcome to members of Havara, Arlington County's Jewish Employee Resource Group, who are also joining us. This program is part of a series called Echoes of the Holocaust, Personal Stories, in partnership with the Havara Jewish Employee Resource Group. The stories in this series convey universal lessons that continue to resonate today about the sanctity of human life and the power of courage and resilience. Also, that we can and should stand up against hatred and discrimination of all kinds. When we see people being isolated, targeted, or marginalized as the other, we cannot be silent. Each of us can and should do something in our own way to make a difference and help make the world a better place. Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, is marked around the world. In Israel, a siren is sounded at sundown when it begins, and again the next morning at 11 a.m., bringing everything and everyone, including traffic, pedestrians, everything, to a halt for 2 minutes of silent observance. It is a very solemn day to honor and remember. Most of you are probably very familiar with Oskar Schindler from the movie Schindler's List. Schindler was a non-Jewish German businessman who saved about 1,200 Jewish lives by putting them to work in his factories. As a result of the movie, he is probably the most famous righteous Gentile, as these non-Jewish heroes are called. But he is by no means the only one. About 24,811 so-called righteous Gentiles are honored at Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust memorial in Jerusalem. Many of their stories have not been told because they were executed by the Nazis. Renée Scott, grandmother of 55 Plus participant Carole Lieber, is not famous like Schindler, but she should be. She was an ordinary young French woman who became an extraordinary hero when she stood up and took brave, selfless action to help others. She was under no obligation to help. She had nothing to gain and everything to lose, including her life and her family's life. As a result of her actions to save Jews, she was sent to a concentration camp. Renée Scott's inspirational legacy is that all of us can be heroes and that we cannot be indifferent to hatred or discrimination of any kind. We can't just look away from human suffering because it's not happening to us or to our group. As Pastor Martin Niemöller, a prominent Lutheran pastor who spoke out publicly against Hitler, said, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. To share Renée Scott's remarkable story, we are very fortunate to have her granddaughter, Carole Lieber, with us today. I am honored and delighted to introduce Carole Lieber. Thank you so much, Carole, for sharing this wonderful story with us.
Thank you, Sheila. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay. I'd also like to welcome my sister, Patty Lieber, who's up in Boston, who's joining us today. And I'm going to share a slideshow with you and talk a little bit about my grandmother, and then take some questions from the audience. Okay, so this is the story about a Christian heroine of the resistance, my grandmother, Renée Scott. She was interred in Ravensbrück, and she was prisoner number 19151. This is a photo I just wanted to share of her family. My grandmother's family came from France, and this was her parents' wedding in 1897. They lived in Calais, and they were a family of lace makers and lace designers. Her father was given an opportunity to work in America, managing lace mills in first starting in Rhode Island. And so the family came to America for that purpose. This is one of the homes they lived in New Jersey, Wucktung, I think this was Wucktung, New Jersey. And my grandmother is right here. Can you see the pointer? I'm not used to doing this with the slideshow. So this is my grandmother, her mother, her younger sister May, and her older sister Yvonne. And this is my grandmother here with her younger sister, May. My grandmother became a dancer. She took dance lessons in New Jersey, which is why I wanted to show you a little bit about her background. When the lace mills all closed due to the war efforts, her father had a very hard time finding work. He did find some work in the United States, but it wasn't enough to sustain the family, and they were limiting immigration at the time. So my great-grandfather was not able to become an American citizen. So the family moved back to Europe. My grandmother actually supported the family by becoming a dancer with the operas in both Belgium and in France. And she traveled throughout Europe with her sister May. This is my grandmother on the left, and this is her sister. And they did that for a number of years. When they weren't dancing for the opera, she was a ballerina. They also worked in other theaters. So this is actually a picture that was taken in 1931 at one of the other theaters that they worked at. And this is a picture of my grandmother around the time that she started getting involved in the war effort. She stopped dancing. Things were very troubling in Europe during the time. And she started working at trade shows. So she started working at trade shows in Paris and in France with a friend of hers. She was introduced by a mutual friend. So this is her at a trade show with Simone Fetter. And this is my grandmother here on the left. So the trade shows also shut down when war came closer in, as Paris was taken over and Belgium was taken over. My grandmother started working for the Belgian Chamber of Commerce in Paris. This is a picture of her at the Belgian Chamber of Commerce. This is my grandmother here on the right. And on the left is her friend Simone Fetter. In 1940, she learned from Simone that they were falsifying documents and passports to help Jews escape Europe. And my grandmother became involved in that effort. And she was also asked by Simone to carry some papers up to Brussels. And my grandmother had No idea what these papers were. She was trying to obtain a divorce from her husband, who had been living in Africa for years. They had not lived together since my mother was 7 or 8 years old. And so because she was traveling, Simone said, "Can you bring some papers for me?" My grandmother said yes. When she came back, Simone said, "Well, you were actually a courier and were involved in some clandestine operations, aside from the work that they were doing, developing ID cards and passports for the Jews who were escaping." And my grandmother said, "No problem." And she accepted the assignment and quickly became, unbeknownst to her, involved in the largest spy organization that took place in Europe, and that was called the Rote Kapelle by the Germans, l'Orchestre Rouge by the French, and the Red Orchestra by the Americans. And she continued with this work. Here's another picture of Simone Fetter. They were very close friends. You can see this was shortly before her arrest and Simone's arrest. So during the week, they forged papers and passports. They did about 100 a week. They worked with the Cléry and Orature du Louvre, which was also very involved in helping Jewish children escape France. I remember one time my grandmother told me that they also helped people escape in bear barrels. They hid people in bear barrels and got them out of Europe that way. But what she was arrested for eventually was because of her involvement with the Rote Kapelle. So I wanted to just show a couple of slides for those of you who are not familiar with the Rote Kapelle, just so you can see how large the organization was. Leopold Trepper was the head of the group here in France. So she was working out of France, but she was also working in Belgium. So my grandmother was actually involved with both of these groups. Leon Grossvogel was the head of an organization that was set up as a false front company to help with espionage. And even though this is considered a Russian organization, it's been considered a Russian organization, it was not comprised of Russian citizens. It was ordinary citizens. It was people who just wanted to defeat the Nazis, who wanted to put an end to the war, who wanted to save the Jews, who were just really upset by what was going on, and so many paid dearly with their lives. Here's another photo of the Rote Kapelle in France with Leopold Trepper, just so you can again see how large the organization was. And the organization here, I wanted to show this one because Suzanne Spack was involved in the organization that was working on forging passports and helping the children escape from Europe, for which she was eventually executed. This is a photo of Ravensbrück, where my grandmother was eventually sentenced after she had been working for the resistance and arrested. So what happened is the Germans were closing in on the spy network. The spy network, I want to mention, I have a few notes, I apologize, I don't have them along with my screen, but to the credit of the network, in particular, they were responsible for announcing Operation Barbarossa, which was the plan for the invasion of the USSR, and plans for German tank T-6 Tiger, which made possible the Russian victory at Stalingrad that became the turning point of the war. So there were a lot of efforts going on, both espionage and helping Jews escape Europe at the time. The Nazis arrested Simone and her sister Nellie in November 1942 to help dismantle the network. They set a trap for Trepper, for Leopold Trepper. In the meantime, Simone was allowed to leave the arrest so that she could trap Leo Trepper. And in the meantime, she went up to Brussels to warn my grandmother that this whole organization that she had been a courier for, the Semexco Corporation in Brussels, was about to come down. My grandmother was on vacation in the Ardennes at the time. When she returned, she got a note from her landlord that said a woman had come looking for her, had left her a note. The note didn't mean anything to her. The note said, "Please don't go see the Grossvogels." everybody in that net was arrested on November 19th. My grandmother wasn't there at the time. She was in fact arrested on the 25th of November, which is the same day that they arrested Leo Trepper. And from there, she was interrogated by the Gestapo. They asked her if she would spy for them. They wanted her to turn in folks. She said she knew nobody, she knew nothing. She denied. From the moment she was arrested until the time she was released, she denied. She never admitted to knowing anybody or any names. That was what she had taught, and she did her job very well. When the police saw that she wasn't going to cooperate on 25 November, they sent her to prison at St. Gilles in Brussels, where she stayed until 17 April in 1943, where she was interrogated several times and beaten and remained in solitary confinement and deemed Nacht und Nebel. Nacht und Nebel was nobody had any contact. It was night and fog. That was a German decree, and folks who were deemed Nacht und Nebel were disappeared from the face of the earth. So her family did not know where she was. She had no contact with anyone. She could receive no packages. She could receive no mail. And on 17 April 1943, the trains left Paris with members of the Rote Kapelle. Before, and my grandmother, along with about 100 people, were gathered up. So they were all members who had been involved in the Rote Kapelle. They had a special train to take the members of the network from Paris and Brussels and probably some other locations to be tried and executed and sent to concentration camps. She met up with Simone on the train. Simone had been in Friends prison, and they met up on the train, and that was when she really learned the extent of the network she'd been involved in. Simone was a liaison to Leo Trepper, so she was very much involved in the organization, knew a lot more than my grandmother did. And it's very much, if anyone's worked in intelligence, they have heard of the special compartmentalized intelligence, and that was really the key to the Rote Kapelle. People only knew the information they needed to know. People didn't know who else was in the net. Even when my grandmother was delivering things, she didn't necessarily know who the people were that she was going to meet. She didn't know what she was bringing. She brought papers in linings of her fur coat. She brought a note one time in a false bottom cooking oil, and she was followed, and they were turned in by collaborators and also, as it turns out later, members of the Rote Kapelle, but she certainly did not know that. I don't know if she ever knew that. She certainly didn't know that at the time. She was sent to Berlin, and they went to prison at Moenbeek. They were all chained together and were taken to Alexanderplatz. She was sentenced to death. Simone was taken away. My grandmother never saw her again because Simone was a lot more involved in the organization. They had a lot more information on her. So she was executed. She did not go to a concentration camp. She was beheaded by guillotine, which was one of the standard practices of the Germans at the time, in addition to shooting people and hanging people. When my grandmother was in Moenbeek, she was taken down. That's the largest prison. It was the largest prison in Germany. She was taken down several flights of stairs where she saw people being tortured. And she again was asked about her involvement, and she denied. She was, eventually they took them out of Moenbeek, and during the time that she was there, and I don't know the exact date, but the Allies had bombed Berlin. So Shaw was talked about how she felt bad for the people, but she was very happy to see that in the time that she was there, Berlin had been bombed. And they had been paraded through the streets. People threw things at them. They cussed at them. They spit on them. But that was nothing like the torture she was to experience at Ravensbrück, where she was deemed prisoner number 19151. And she remained there until she was liberated by the International Red Cross on 23 April 1945. So, excuse me. There we go. So this is a picture of some of the women at Ravensbrück camp. And this is some of the women who were liberated with her by Count Folk Bernadette when they arrived in Moabit. This is in Moabit, excuse me, Putchord. I think I'm pronouncing that wrong, Sweden. So if I can back up a minute, when she went to St. Gill, she was arrested. They had taken pictures of her family. The Nazis had taken pictures of her family. They threatened her daughter. They threatened her mother. When she went to St. Gill in solitary, she had no contact. Every once in a while, they would let her out in the courtyard by herself. She got a little bit of exercise. She was fed rutabagas and turnips. And then when she got to Ravensbrück, excuse me, it was an even sparser diet. First, when she got to Ravensbrück, they shaved her head, they stripped her naked, they beat her, they interrogated her. The prisoners every day had 3 appels. I remember as a child, and I'm sure my sister remembers this as well, my grandmother lived with us for a while, and she would wake up in the middle of the night screaming, Schnell, Schnell, Appell, Appell, which was hurry up, it's time for the Appell. And she did that for many years. But what got her through was her faith. She was a very faithful Christian woman, and she prayed a lot to God to help her with her suffering and to get her through her time there. Simone, I mentioned, had been executed. She had been taken to Plötzensee. Anyone who went to Plötzensee was executed. They didn't stay there more than a day. And they were all had their heads shaven as well, stripped naked to the waist and guillotined or executed. The camp of Ravensbrück is one that's not well known. When I would tell people when I was growing up that my grandmother had been in Ravensbrück, no one had ever heard of it. It was a camp, in fact, for women. It was a death camp. It was a very brutal camp. It was near Fürstenberg in Germany, which fell behind the Iron Curtain, which is another reason people didn't know much about it. But all the women were treated terribly there. All their belongings were taken away. They were given a little striped outfit. They had no windows in the cells, even though it's in northern Germany where there was snow. They had little sandals on their feet. That was the extent of the clothes that they had while they were there. They were fed a piece of bread, some watery soup made with rutabaga. Once a month, they were given some type of margarine, which they did not want to eat because they thought it might have been made from human fat. They were given soap that was made from human fat. And they all worked at least 12 hours a day. They slept in 3-tiered wooden bunks, 3 to 4 people per bunk. And the conditions were horrible. So while there, my grandmother developed typhus, pleurisy. She was sterilized, had double pneumonia. She lost vision and hearing due to the repeated blows she had to her head. She developed heart issues, circulation problems. She developed tumors from the beatings. But even that didn't compare to the suffering of the Polish prisoners. They were called rabbits, and they were regularly experimented on. Horrible, horrible. The Germans were trying to see the effect of medicine on gangrene, so they caused women to have gangrene, and the photos of the Polish rabbits are really just heartbreaking. Ravensbrück had a gas chamber and a crematorium, but they couldn't kill people fast enough. So they sent people out to other camps to be gassed. And the crematorium was used for the people who died in camp. People had to regularly walk over dead bodies. Anybody who was not fit to work was exterminated, or they died. They died of their horrible health conditions. They opened a Siemens factory there, which made small parts munitions, and my grandmother worked there. for a while. She was chosen for that job because having been a ballerina, she was very fit, and she had very nimble fingers, which were well suited for the position. But she and the other prisoners broke as many instruments as they could. During the time she was there, at the end of the war, 5,000 to 6,000 prisoners were killed in 1945, alone, as the Russian army was approaching. And she was liberated by Count Foch Bernadotte, the head of the International Red Cross, in the first transport of women. There were 165 women rescued. They were Belgian, they were French, primarily, also some Polish, and the women their passage was secured with flour and gold. As they were leaving, the transport was bombed by Allied planes. Many women were killed. They eventually got to Lubeck. Then they were transferred on trains to Denmark. The trains were attacked. They eventually ended up in Patburg, where they were greeted by flowers, and then put on a boat to Malmo, and then on to a town I can't pronounce, Pjatteryd, which is a small little village, 240 miles from Stockholm, and they stayed a few weeks. So while they were there, the women were given, they were all inspected, they were brought back to good health. The purpose of sending them there was so they could recuperate their health, and they had their photos taken. So these were the Belgian women who were staying there. The women were distributed to different camps, but this particular group has to be recovery camps. This particular group happens to be the Belgian women, and in all, over 143,000 prisoners stayed at Ravensbrück over the course of the war. These are some more pictures. This is her friend, Lillian Fretter, her very good friend Lillian Fretter, and some of the other women who were there at the camp. And this is another picture of Lillian Fretter. She had been a parachutist for the underground, and these are some of her medals. Try to expand a little bit so you can see the one here is the Ravensbrück medal, and it's not a very clear picture. I apologize for that, but it's the best we can get. The last slide was Martha Vanderhook, and Martha Vanderhook is known to people because she was also known as Martha Bowman. She was one of the American women who was actually at Ravensbrück camp. This was just a note on the back of a photo my grandmother made. Sorry, I'm trying to back up the picture here. The reason I wanted to show you that picture is, despite all the suffering the women had, they still found time to stay in good spirits. So this was actually a little play that they put on, a little skit that they put on to thank the people who had rescued them, to thank the people of Sweden who they were staying with, who were their hosts, who had brought them clothes and fed them, and and made them feel safe. These last couple of slides, they're my grandmother's prisoner of war record, one from France and one from Belgium. And these are photos of her medals. You've seen Liliane, you've seen Simone. This is a Ravensbrück pin. And then this is a medal that she got for Ravensbrück. And this is the Croix de Guerre given to her by Belgium for her patriotism. This is an article she had kept about, it's in French, but it talks about how the Germans made soap from human fat. And then these are some of the books that were written by the women who stayed in Ravensbrück. Probably the most famous is by Corrie ten Boom, The Hiding Place. They made a movie of it. This one here by Gerda van der Kirchhoff. Another one here by Jane Ponsant. And the reason I wanted to include this, I was telling Sheila the other day, if you look here, I know Jeanne Ponsant, she became a very good friend of my grandmother's. Her husband was very involved in the net, as was she. But you can see here, she was in Ravensbrück from 1942 to 44. And then she was sent to Mauthausen and she was released. So she did make it out alive. But if you Google her name, for example, Wikipedia will say that she was at Mauthausen. It doesn't even mention that she was at Ravensbrück for 3 years. And it's just an example of how the history of women is so forgotten. And then it will also say they don't know what happened to her. Well, she obviously survived. She wrote a book, and you can Google the book. You can actually purchase this book. It's in better condition than this one. This is the one my mom gave me. My mom wrote on it. She wrote some notes before giving this to me. But I wanted to highlight the fact that so much of the women's stories, so much of the women who fought in the resistance, who fought against Hitler, the stories are only now coming to light, and we're running out of time for the few remaining survivors to tell their story. This was one of the first books written about Ravensbrück by Simone St. Clair. And I included this book as well, even though it's not about Ravensbrück, it's about Breendonk, because I wanted to make sure that people knew that certainly in Belgium after the war, they wanted to make sure that everybody in Belgium knew about the atrocities that happened in the concentration camp. And it is a requirement in Belgium. You cannot graduate high school unless you have visited Breendonk and toured the concentration camp and learned the lesson. So my brother was stationed in NATO for a while, and his son went to school there, and that was one of his requirements, to go to Breendonk, even though he wasn't in high school yet. My grandmother eventually wanted to come to America. She was released. My mom married a soldier. We came to America. And when she applied to come to the United States, the FBI did an investigation on her because she was considered a communist. That was the time of McCarthyism. So this is just one page from the FBI now released files. They were secret. They were released after, I think it was 50 years. And then this is a newsletter that the folks in Ravensbrück kept going. The survivors got together regularly. My grandmother didn't go. I think she went once. And she was eventually honored by a couple of organizations for her work, one of them being the Boston Apparel Lodge of the B'nai B'rith. This is her getting her award. This is our family with her as she received her award. My mother, my sister Patty, who's on with me on the call, myself, my sister's ex-husband, and my grandmother. She spoke at the State House on Holocaust. She spoke a lot in schools. So she always taught the lessons. Here she is with Governor Dukakis, Kitty Dukakis, and Cardinal Law. This is a letter that the B'nai B'rith wrote her, thanking her for her participation. And this is her speaking to school children in Boston. An article that was written about her in Boston Seniority magazine, newspaper, excuse me, about some of the things she did during the war, her obituary. And then this you can find online, Echoes and Reflection. It's a little synopsis of some of the things she did. And her story continues to be told. It's taught in schools, and it's and the lessons are shared. So, you know, it's a lot to cover in a short amount of time. I wanted to give folks a little feel for what Ravensbrück was all about and what she went through, in addition to the work that she did, helping Jews escape Europe and working with the underground. But the thing that was always most important to me is people would ask her, you know, why did you do this? You didn't have to do this. You put your family at risk. You gave up everything. And would you do it again? And she would always say, of course I would, because it's the right thing to do. So needless to say, she was my role model, and a role model for a lot of other people, people who were inspired by her, and have become actually community activists as a result of the lessons they heard from her in the school. So very proud of her legacy. So thank you for spending some time with me. While I could share some stories about my grandmother, and I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of questions. So I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Carol, for that wonderful talk and for sharing the story. Just amazing, fascinating, inspiring, just wonderful.
Thank you.
So please, if you have a question, you're more than welcome to put it in the chat, or if you'd like to just unmute yourselves, please do that or raise your hand through the reactions function.
Yeah, and actually, if I could, Sheila, I would like to ask my sister if she has anything to add. She knows my grandmother's story as well as I. Patty, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's the bulk of the synopsis, but I also want to say that she had always told us when she knew that the Germans were moving in on her, any documents or any paper that she had pertaining to her family in Paris, because our mother was a teenager, she was living with her grandparents. In Paris, my grandmother ate everything so that the Germans would not have that information, because of course, if they couldn't get to her, they were going to go to Paris and pick up my mom and her grandparents. And of course, Carol and I might not have been here then. So my mom and her grandparents, my grandmother's parents, were actually sort of protected in that vein, that they did not know where my grandmother was, but they also remained safe. And I put quotes around that, you know, safe as anyone can be during a war when people are being bombed, but at least their safety was not in jeopardy. So they did not, my mother did not know her mother was alive until she was released in 1945.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. I actually have a letter that my mother had written to Saint-Gilles prison, because when my grandmother was arrested by the Nazis, her neighbors knew it, the janitor knew it. So they told her friends that she'd been taken away by the Nazis. And so they did know she went to Saint-Gilles, but that's where she became Nocte Noble. So my mother had written a letter to the prison months later. My grandma was actually gone by then. And it said, please, we have no word of my of my mother, and I'm supposed to have surgery, and we don't know if she's dead or alive, and you know what happened to her. So so thanks for reminding me of that, Patty.
Brittany, you have your hand up.
Yes, we have some questions here that I can kind of do a. God, it'll hear you.
I don't need it.
Yeah, you're okay.
2 questions. How was it that your grandmother was able to survive almost 2.5 years in Ravensbrück when the brutality and the daily deaths that people experienced? What made her able to survive under those conditions?
Thank you for that question. I think one of the things that helped a lot was her training as a ballerina. She spoke about that often. When she was in St. Gilles, she danced, she exercised every day to the extent that she was able. So having arriving in Ravensbrück with some strength helped her a lot. I believe her faith helped her a lot. She was very prayerful. She also had a good network of friends, and she would talk about how people would help each other as they were able. If somebody fell down, someone would, you know, try to pick them up and give them the courage to go on. And she, you know, shared one story when she had typhus and she was becoming delusional, and people kind of talked her down, and they said, you know, pull yourself together, and you know, you have to do this. And so she was able to kind of come around and give herself some strength. And another time where they had to run up a hill, and people who couldn't make it were sent in one direction, and those people were sent to their death, and the other ones who could make it were free to go. And how she struggled, and people were just cheering her on and saying, you can make it, Mickey. Mickey was one of the names that she used in the camps. So she had a few names she used, and a lot of people didn't use their real names. They didn't want people to know who they were. So they didn't know who they were, they couldn't get any information from them. So Mickey was the last name she used. She'd also gone by Daisy and Carmen. And she was tiny. My grandmother was very tiny, as you could see from the pictures. So she was named Mickey for Mickey Mouse. It was a little affectionate term, but I think that had a lot to do with it. Patty, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think for her, it's what she always said, her faith. Our grandmother was a very, very devout Christian, but she was so committed to what she did until the day she died. And she died 2 days after her 99th birthday. You know, when we would ask her, you know, why did you do this? You didn't have to. Not saying that you shouldn't do that, but she said it was the right thing to do. And if more people would do these things, then the world would be a better place. She never once regretted what she did, and she had zero animosity against German people. She hated Nazis, but not Germans, which when I was much younger, I was very stumped by that. I'm like, but the people were German. She goes, no, but it was the Nazis. It was not the German people who did this to me. And in fact, my grandmother had German friends, you know, as we were growing up, she had German friends. And I just think her faith that she really did believe that she would survive. And I think her desire to see her family and our mom.
Then I have a second question. I'm reading the book, The Nine by Gwen Strauss, who was also in Ravensbrück. Did your grandmother have any, or were you in fact contacted by Miss Strauss when she was writing her book about 9 survivors of who escaped in 1944 from Ravensbrück?
Not me.
No, no. In fact, the only person who ever contacted us was, interestingly enough, the person who found the FBI file on my grandmother. He wrote a book on the Rote Kapelle, and he didn't know my grandmother's story. He didn't know a lot of the stories of Ravensbrück, and he wrote the book to actually dispel a lot of the myths about the Red Orchestra, that it was this big Soviet spy organization, when in fact it was an organization of many, many resistant groups, people of all faiths, people of all nationalities. And so he found us because my grandmother had been interviewed as part of the Show Up project by Steven Spielberg. So she does have a video at the Holocaust Museum, and you can also find it online. It's on Facebook. And so we met with him, and it was only then really that we even knew that she was involved in an organization called the Rote Kapelle. We knew she had been involved in an organization, but we had no idea that it had a name or all of the complexities. So other than that, no, but I have personally contacted a couple of people whose books I have read, including Sarah Helm, who's written a tremendous book on Ravensbrück. And it's just been very hard to find the survivors, because one thing that I should mention, so I'm glad you asked your question, because I overlooked this, when the Russians were approaching and the Germans knew it was over in 1945, they destroyed almost every single record at Ravensbrück. They destroyed records at Alexanderplatz. So there's no record of my grandmother. There's no record. There were the records that the Belgian government had, and witness testimonies and what have you, but there are no German records about Ravensbrück. They destroyed all the records, and everybody knows the Germans were known for keeping meticulous records. So that way they kept their war crimes hidden, because they knew they were going to be arrested for war crimes. So they made sure that that things were gone. But I've always welcomed anybody who's asked about my grandmother. I'd be happy to help anyone interested in writing a book. So, but not this, I have not been contacted by this particular person, no.
But do you know that book? Have you heard of it?
I have not heard of that one. Can you put it in the chat? Because I'd love to read it. I regularly read books on the Holocaust, and especially the women of the Holocaust, because their stories really aren't being shared, and they need to be told. So thank you. I see Stephanie Teber on the other online chat has their hand up.
Yes. Thank you very much, Carol. This was a very interesting talk. I know you said that your grandmother was very, very religious and faithful.
Mhm.
What personal qualities, or what when she was raised as a small child, I think what she did was so extraordinary. And many of the people who rescued Jews they minimized it. They said, just like her, they said, it was the right thing to do. I didn't do anything extraordinary. But what were the qualities, aside from her religious background, that allowed her to do such an amazing and brave thing?
I think she was very resourceful all the time and had a positive outlook. That's the one thing I remember the most about my grandmother is, despite everything that happened to her and all her suffering, she didn't complain. She had horrible circulation in her legs, and every once in a while she'd say, you know, we'd ask her if she wanted to go out, and she'd say, oh, my legs are really hurting me. And that was the extent that I ever heard my grandmother complain growing up. And she was always ready to have an adventure. So I think part of it was just kind of that spirit of I guess like really kind of like a risk taking. In fact, one of the pictures of her and Simone on the back, which was after they had gotten involved in the resistance work, was a note about, you know, oh, if only we had known the adventures that we were going to get into. So I think it was wanting to do good things for people, certainly the religious background, but also just kind of a trait of being more of a risk taker. So for example, how she became a dancer at the opera is a good example. She was out, she needed a job. Her family wasn't working. Nobody could find work. And so she applied for a job as a secretary at the opera house. And they said, do you know how to type? And she said, oh, sure I do. Do you know how to file? Sure I do. She didn't know how to do any of that. And so after about 2 days, they said, you know, you're really a terrible secretary, but we really like you and you're cute and you're fun. Can you do anything else? And she said, well, I can dance. And they said, you can dance? And she had learned to dance in New Jersey. So she said, yes, I am a ballerina. I trained to be a ballerina. So that's how she got hired as a ballerina for the opera. And then she said, well, my sister's a dancer too. Her sister wasn't a dancer. Her sister hadn't taken ballet lessons, but she convinced them that they needed to hire her sister. And so her sister started working at the ballet and became a better ballerina than her, from what I understand, because she became a prima ballerina and my grandmother was a second. So I think that was part of it too, the willingness to take risks and to you know, not necessarily know what was coming. But I also think part of it was when the family came to America, they moved around a lot. They went where the jobs were. And as the lace mills were closing down, and certainly as World War I was getting into gear, they did what they needed to do to survive. When they went back to France, they took the jobs that they could find to survive. So I think part of her bringing up is also part of that story and what gave her that spirit. Patty, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you said it all, but she was quite an adventurer. She was always ready to go out. Nothing would hold her back. And she also had a very good sense of humor. My grandmother was almost always in a good mood, which I couldn't understand with all the atrocities she witnessed. But she also would say, you cannot dwell on the past. You have to respect the past, but you can't live in the past.
Yeah. And I think too, to comment on something else about the people who did things. I think there were just a lot of people who did things and they're just not talked about. I also grew up hearing about how my mother, when she was living with her grandmother, would go into the fields and try to rescue the parachutists, and how the town hid someone who had parachuted a British soldier. They had him in a farmhouse and he pretended to be deaf mute. And so he was able to escape the Germans. And my mother attacked a German one day because a Jewish man had taken a loaf of bread to feed his family. And so she beat him. She was taken before the commander, and her mother was in a concentration camp and she didn't care. She saw something. So I think there might be some genetic material in there as well that, you know, kind of a resilience that just seems to run in the family, that they're risk takers. And I do a lot with genealogy, with the Arlington 55 plus genealogy. And through the course of that, I learned that my mother's first husband had been in a concentration camp. I didn't know that. My mother never mentioned it. He was a downed pilot in France. And I found out that he had done forced labor in Ebensee camp. And I asked my mother and she said, oh yeah, I knew that. You know, so it was like, not that it was not a big deal important, but she just knew so many people who had suffered those consequences. She just didn't mention it. And I found out that her cousin had been in a concentration camp. He was a British soldier and he was in Drancy. So there are three people in her family who were all Christians for different reasons in 3 different concentration camps. Yeah, I think it's just, it's also something they didn't dwell on. My grandmother would tell the story of being in prison when she was asked, but for the most part, it wasn't something she spoke about. And when it really hit me was when I was at her house and it was the 50th anniversary of her being arrested by the Nazis. And I said, you're so quiet today. What's going on? My grandmother's always so talkative. And she said, well, it's the 50th anniversary of when the Nazis came for me and arrested me. And it really struck me because my grandmother and I are 50 years apart. We always celebrated our birthday together. Her birthday is February 13th, mine's the 27th. And we celebrated the weekend in between. I thought, wow, you were my age when you were arrested. And it never had struck me the same way before that, would I have done the same thing at that age? Would I have had the courage? Would I have been so willing to take those risks? And it's a question I ask myself a lot. And it's something that's really guided me in leadership positions in wanting to speak out and say, well, what's the worst that's going to happen to me? I'm not going to be sentenced to death if I speak out when I see something wrong. And so it's been a moral compass for me, for sure.
Wonderful.
I think we have another question in here. Is that okay?
Yes, please. I was just going to call on you. Yes, please.
Hi.
I got a lot.
First, I wanted to thank you for this presentation. It's a remarkable story and a real inspiration. And
Thank you.
my question goes to the age of your grandmother when she was arrested and when all this was going on. I missed that at the beginning. So how old was she, let's say, when she was arrested?
Okay, now you're asking me to do math. 1906 to 1942,
36.
36, yeah.
36.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're welcome. And Simone was in her early 20s, by the way. Simone was very young. She was a very brave woman. And I really like to share her story because she doesn't have anyone to tell her story. And she did so much that we'll never know. And she paid for it with her life. My grandmother suffered a lot, but she was able to live. We used to tease her. We used to say, oh, Mimi, you want to outlive all your Nazi captors. That's your goal. And I think she probably did. But yeah, so many brave people, so many stories untold. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, by the way, at WWII. That had been my intent, but we had a family member who got sick. So we had to make sure COVID protocols needed to make sure that we couldn't be there in person. So anyway, to keep everybody safe. So I apologize. Maybe we could do it another time in person.
Do we have any other questions at WWII?
What was in that FBI file?
Oh,
Just ask.
someone wants to know what was in the FBI file.
Oh, yeah, thank you. So the FBI file is what really detailed her involvement in the Rot-Capelle. That's what the FBI was interested in. And that's how we really learned that the courier activity part of what she was doing. We knew she had been a courier, but we didn't know what kind of papers she was bringing. She didn't know what kind of papers. They were asking about her contact with the members of the Rot-Capelle, the Grossvogels, the Drey, who were all arrested, some of them executed as part of that Semexco portion. But these, again, were not communists. It was a misnomer. It was something that the Germans basically fabricated to say, these are the people who are enemies of the state. And that was the purpose of this book that this other author wrote. Unfortunately, it's just in French. It's only available in French, but he dispels a lot of the myths of who the people were who were involved in the Rot-Capelle, to show that it was many, many people who wanted to defeat Nazism, who wanted to save Jews, had absolutely nothing to do with communists and were not communists themselves. But when my grandmother tried to come to America, it was the time of McCarthyism. So anybody who was branded communist went through this. And they did, in fact, declared that the people who were involved in this organization were not communists. Some of the people had been declared communists, but they weren't. And then there were other people like Leon Trepper, who was in fact a communist. And in fact, he turned in a lot of the turned in a lot of the people working in his organization to help the Communist Party. He didn't care that there were people working for him who suffered, who had helped him execute things that actually helped the Russians, that helped all of us win in World War II. His allegiance was to the communists. That is not the case of the other people who were working in his ring. Certainly was not my grandmother's involved in this, and neither was Simone Fetter a communist.
We have another question in the chat. What did your grandmother attribute to her long life after all the ordeals she faced?
Wine.
Wine. Did you say wine?
I said wine,
Yeah.
wine, faith, and family.
Yeah. My grandmother had a glass of wine every day. And it kept her healthy. It was good for her heart. And actually, when she went in the nursing home and she didn't have wine, it really did lead to her demise. But yeah, she ate a Mediterranean diet after the concentration camp. That helped a lot. But she had a strong constitution and she didn't complain. I think all those years of suffering in the concentration camp, there wasn't anything that was going to come up that was going to seem as bad to her. So just having that strong faith, but she prayed every day. She absolutely prayed every day. It helped get her through the concentration camp, and it definitely helped get her through life. Faith in God, for sure.
Carol and Patty, do you have, we have just about a moment left, but I'm wondering if either or both of you have a message that you would like for the listeners to take away from your grandmother's story. What would you like people to learn from this?
Well, for myself, and I don't want to take anything away from Carol, for myself, what's always been my litmus test for my grandmother is to do the right thing and what I believe is the right thing, regardless of the cost, whether it's popular or not popular. If you have faith that something is the right thing to do, then that's what you have to do. And nothing should dissuade you from that. As Carol had stated, there have been times in our lives, we've been through the turmoil of the 60s, the 70s, and always being in protest and whatever. And even though maybe you might have been threatened with being arrested, I knew even if I was arrested, which I never have been, I wasn't going to a concentration camp. I wasn't going to be executed. I wasn't going to be hung. I wasn't going to be decapitated. So my grandmother has always been my litmus test. And especially when I've been faced with some adversity, because I've always felt like no matter what happens to me, no matter what happens, no matter how bad it is, it can't be as bad as what my grandmother faced. So that helps me get through tough times, because we all have tough times. I mean, that's life.
I couldn't say it any differently. That's been my litmus test as well. When things are tough, when I see people downtrodden, when I write on my Facebook page, to save Ukraine, to boycott companies that are in Russia. I'm very much an activist. It's what's guided me in my civil rights work. It's why I'm very passionate about human rights, disability rights. I serve on the Human Rights Commission. It's just been a key driver for me all my life is hearing those words. I would do it again because it was the right thing to do. So do the right thing. There are people who need help, and maybe you can only do a small part, but it's a part. Every bit helps.
Mm-hmm.
Every bit helps.
Thank you so much to both Carol and Patty for those very memorable words and important lessons. I'd like to thank you both for sharing the story of your amazing grandmother. She certainly is an inspiring example for us all. And from what I have seen, her legacy lives on in both of you. Clearly, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
Oh,
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for giving us an opportunity to speak about her, especially on this very important day for the Jewish community. Thank you.
And thank both of you for allowing us to honor and remember your grandmother along with you and your family, especially on this day, and to learn this very, very important history. And also, thank you so much for the strong spirit of hope that your grandmother represents, that good people like her can make our world a better place just by doing the right thing. Thank you for that upbeat, positive inspiration of hope. Thank you to all of our participants, both in person at Lubber Run and also
Thank you.
on Zoom. We really appreciate it. This has been very moving, very important and educational. Thank you.